Marco Rivera wiped the grease from his hands and glanced at the clock hanging crooked on the garage wall. It was almost 6. His son, Danny, would be waiting at the neighbor's house by now, probably doing homework at the kitchen table or pretending to while he stared out the window, hoping to see his dad's truck pull up. Marco's chest tightened the way it always did when he thought about Danny waiting. The boy was 8 years old and had already learned patience the hard way. Rivera, you planning to work or daydream? Adriana Mendoza's voice cut through the shop like a blade. She stood in the doorway of her office, arms crossed, her expression carved from stone. She was the kind of boss who believed fear kept people in line, and she was good at it. Marco had worked at her auto shop for 3 years, and in all that time, he'd never seen her smile. Not once. Just finishing up the transmission on the Honda, ma'am, Marco said quietly. He'd learned not to argue. Arguing meant getting written up, and getting written up meant risking the only job that kept food on the table and the lights on in their tiny apartment. Adriana's eyes narrowed. You've got 2 more cars on the schedule. I don't pay you to leave early. Marco nodded and turned back to the engine in front of him. His back ached and his hands were raw, but he didn't say anything. He never did. That was the deal when you were desperate. You swallowed your pride, you kept your head down, and you survived. The sun was sinking low when Marco finally rolled out from under the last car of the day. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and his knees cracked when he stood. He washed his hands in the industrial sink and grabbed his jacket from the hook. The shop was empty except for Adriana, who was locked in her office doing paperwork. Marco didn't bother saying goodbye. She wouldn't have answered anyway. He stepped out into the cool evening air and felt the tension in his shoulders ease just a little. The street was quiet, lined with closed storefronts and a few parked cars. Marco started walking toward the bus stop, his mind already on Danny. Maybe they'd stop by the corner store and pick up something for dinner. Nothing fancy. Maybe some chicken and rice. Danny loved rice. That's when he saw her. A little girl, maybe 10 years old, stumbled on the sidewalk about 20 feet ahead. She was wearing a school uniform, her backpack hanging off one shoulder. At first, Marco thought she just tripped, but then she stumbled again, harder this time, and her knees buckled. She fell forward onto the pavement, and her backpack slid off and landed beside her. Marco's heart kicked into overdrive. He dropped his jacket and ran. By the time he reached her, the girl was lying on her side, her eyes half closed, her breathing shallow and fast. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her lips had a faint blue tint. Marco knelt beside her and gently touched her shoulder. "Hey, sweetheart, can you hear me?" His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. The girl's eyes fluttered open for a second, unfocused, and then closed again. Marco looked around. The street was empty. No cars. No people. His phone was in his jacket pocket, somewhere behind him on the ground. He could run back and grab it, call 911, wait for an ambulance. But something in his gut told him there wasn't time. "Adriana!" he shouted toward the shop. "Adriana, I need help." The office light stayed on. No response. Marco's mind raced. He thought about his son. He thought about his job. He thought about what Adriana would say if he left the shop unattended, if he made a scene, if he caused trouble. She'd told him just last week that she was watching him closely. That one more mistake, and he was out. One more mistake, and Danny wouldn't have food, wouldn't have a roof. The girl's breath hitched, a soft, desperate sound. Marco didn't think anymore. He scooped her up in his arms, backpack and all, and started running. She was light, too light, and her head lolled against his chest. Marco's lungs burned as he sprinted down the block toward the main road. He didn't know where the nearest hospital was, but he knew it was south. He'd passed it on the bus a few times. Maybe 10 blocks. Maybe more. He didn't care. He just ran. His boots pounded the pavement. His breath came in ragged gasps. People on the sidewalk turned to stare, but no one stopped him. No one asked if he needed help. Marco's arms ached, but he held the girl tighter, whispering to her even though he didn't know if she could hear him. "Stay with me, okay? You're going to be fine. Just stay with me." By the time he reached the hospital, His legs were shaking and his vision was blurred with sweat. He burst through the emergency room doors and stumbled toward the front desk. "She collapsed," he gasped. "On the street. She's not breathing right." The nurse behind the desk took one look at the girl and hit a button. Within seconds, a team of doctors and nurses swarmed around them. Someone took the girl from Marco's arms, and he stood there empty-handed, his heart hammering in his chest. "Sir, are you her father?" a nurse asked. Marco shook his head. "No, I found her. She fell." The nurse nodded and gestured toward a row of chairs. "Please wait here. We'll let you know." Marco sat down, his legs giving out beneath him. His hands were still shaking. He stared at the floor and tried to catch his breath. He didn't know the girl's name, didn't know where she lived or who her parents were. All he knew was that he'd done the only thing he could. An hour later, a woman rushed through the emergency room doors. She was tall and elegant, dressed in a tailored coat, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her eyes were red and wide with panic. "My daughter," she said to the nurse at the desk. "Isabella Quintana. She was brought in." The nurse checked her computer and nodded. "She's stable. The doctors are with her now." The woman's knees buckled, and she gripped the edge of the desk to steady herself. Relief and fear and gratitude all crashed over her face at once. Then her eyes landed on Marco, still sitting in the corner, covered in sweat and grease. "You," she said, walking toward him. "You brought her in?" Marco stood up, suddenly aware how dirty he was, how out of place. "Yes, ma'am. I saw her fall. I didn't know what else to do." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "You saved her life." Her voice broke. The doctors said if she'd been out there any longer, if no one had brought her in. Marco didn't know what to say. He just nodded. The woman reached out and took his hand in both of hers. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you." Marco pulled his hand back gently. "I'm just glad she's okay. I should go. My son's waiting for me." He turned to leave, but the woman called after him. "Wait, please. What's your name?" "Marco Rivera." She repeated it softly, like she was committing it to memory. "I'm Valeria Quintana. I won't forget this, Mr. Rivera. I promise." Marco gave her a tired smile and walked out into the night. When he got back to the shop, it was locked. His jacket was still on the ground where he'd dropped it. He picked it up and checked his phone. 3 missed calls from Adriana. 1 voicemail. He played it. "You abandoned your post. Rivera, you left without permission. Don't bother coming in tomorrow. You're done." Marco stood there in the dark, staring at his phone. Done. Fired. No job. No income. No way to pay rent or buy groceries or keep Danny safe. He sat down on the curb and put his head in his hands. When Marco got home that night, Danny was already asleep on the couch, his homework spread out on the coffee table. Marco covered him with a blanket and sat down on the floor beside him, watching the rise and fall of his son's chest. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. He just sat there in the dark, wondering how he was going to tell Danny that everything had just fallen apart. The next morning, there was a knock on the door. Marco opened it to find Valeria Quintana standing on his doorstep, flanked by 2 men in suits and a woman holding a leather briefcase. "Mr. Rivera," Valeria said. "May I come in?" Marco blinked, still half asleep, still trying to process what he was seeing. Yeah, sure." Valeria stepped inside, her team following. She looked around the small apartment, taking in the worn furniture and the peeling wallpaper, and something in her expression softened. "I did some research last night," she said. "I know you were fired. I know why." Marco's stomach sank. "Look, I'm sorry if I caused trouble for you or your daughter. Valeria held up a hand. "You caused no trouble, Mr. Rivera. You saved my daughter's life. And the person who fired you for it is about to learn a very hard lesson." She nodded to one of the men in suits. He opened a folder and handed it to Marco. "Adriana Mendoza's auto shop operates under a contract with my company," Valeria said. "I oversee a network of service centers across the state. Ms. Mendoza's contract is being terminated, effective immediately, for violating workplace safety standards and employee welfare policies. She will also be facing a formal investigation. Marco stared at the folder. He couldn't speak. Valeria smiled. I'm offering you a position, Mr. Rivera. I need someone honest and brave to run my flagship service center downtown. Full salary, medical benefits, performance bonuses, and a signing bonus to help you get settled. If you're interested... Marco looked up at her, his throat tight. Why me? Valeria's smile didn't waver. Because you did the right thing when it cost you everything. That's the kind of person I want leading my team. Marco's hands trembled as he held the folder. He thought about Danny, about the bills, about the fear that had been sitting in his chest since last night. Yes, he said. Yes, I'm interested. Valeria extended her hand, and Marco shook it. 6 months later, Marco stood in the lobby of the downtown service center, watching his team work. The place was clean, efficient, and fair. He'd hired people he trusted, people who needed a chance, people like him. Danny came by after school sometimes, sitting in Marco's office doing homework while his dad finished up paperwork. He was proud of his father. Marco could see it in the way he talked about him to his friends. One afternoon, Valeria stopped by with Isabella. The girl had fully recovered, her cheeks pink and her eyes bright. She ran up to Marco and threw her arms around him. Hi, hero, she said, grinning. Marco laughed and ruffled her hair. Hey, kiddo, how you feeling? Good, she said. Really good. Valeria watched them, her eyes warm. She insists on calling you that, she said. I've tried to explain your name as Marco, but she won't budge. Marco smiled. I don't mind. Danny stood beside his dad, beaming, and Marco put a hand on his shoulder. For the first time in years, Marco felt something he'd almost forgotten. He felt safe. He felt steady. He felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay.